All right, so we're back for another deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at white-collar crime.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, it should be a good one. You guys send in some really interesting sources this time.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the variety this time around.
Yeah, we've got a law firm website focusing on Pakistani law,
Mm.
which I'm really interested in to see how that kind of differs from the American perspective.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
And then we also have a really interesting article on the impact of white-collar crime from National University.
Yeah, that one was really eye-opening.
And just to ground us, we've also got a good old-fashioned Cambridge Dictionary definition of white-collar crime.
We're going to start with the basics, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And then just to round things out, we've got an explainer article from Investopedia.
Love a good explainer.
Same. And then a Wikipedia overview, because of course.
Of course. Got the Wikipedia.
And then finally a WEX legal encyclopedia entry.
Wow, that's a lot to cover.
It is, but I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how all of these different perspectives come together.
I think so, too. I'm particularly interested in that Pakistani legal perspective.
Me too. So should we just jump right in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I guess the first thing we need to do is define what exactly we're talking about when we say white-collar crime. So, we've got the classic definition from the Cambridge Dictionary. Financially motivated nonviolent crime committed by business and government professionals.
Right. But then you look at the Pakistani law firm website, and they cite the National Accountability Ordinance of 1999, which broadens that scope considerably.
Oh, interesting. In what way?
Well, they explicitly include public officials and anyone in a corporate setting.
So it's not just limited to, like, high-level executives or something like that.
Right. It seems like they're really trying to capture a wider range of potential offenders.
So it's interesting to see how that differs from how we typically think about white-collar crime.
It is. And it raises the question of why they've chosen to define it so broadly.
Yeah, I mean, what's the thinking behind that?
Maybe it reflects a different cultural understanding of corruption and accountability.
Or maybe they're just trying to be more comprehensive in their approach.
It's hard to say for sure without digging deeper into their legal system and the context behind this ordinance.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm.
But it definitely highlights the fact that there's no single universal definition of white-collar crime.
Absolutely. It can vary depending on cultural norms, legal systems, and all sorts of other factors.
Okay, so we've got the definition out of the way. But before we get too deep into the legal weeds, I think it's important to talk about the impact of these crimes. Because it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, right?
Right. It's about real people and real consequences.
Exactly. And all of our sources really emphasize the vast financial harm that white-collar crime causes.
Oh, yeah. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars annually in the U.S. alone.
And that's just the direct costs, right?
Right. The indirect costs are much harder to quantify, but arguably just as significant.
Like?
Well, think about the erosion of public trust in institutions.
Yeah, if you can't trust the people who are supposed to be managing your money or regulating the markets, it's bound to have a negative impact on the whole system.
Exactly. And then there's the distortion of markets. When companies are engaging in unfair or illegal practices, it creates an uneven playing field for everyone else.
And that can stifle innovation and economic growth, right?
Right. And then you have the potential for social inequality to be exacerbated.
In what way?
Well, if wealthy individuals and corporations are able to get away with financial crimes while ordinary people are struggling to make ends meet, it just widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
It creates this sense that there are two sets of rules, one for the rich and powerful and one for everyone else.
Exactly. And that can lead to a lot of resentment and distrust in society.
So it's really a ripple effect that goes far beyond the immediate financial losses.
Absolutely. It's about the fabric of society being damaged.
Yeah, and a good example of that is the Enron scandal, which the National University article mentions.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Enron, that's a classic case study in the devastating consequences of white-collar crime.
So just to refresh our memories, what happened with Enron?
Well, they were an energy company that used all sorts of accounting tricks to hide billions of dollars in debt and inflate their stock price.
And people bought into it, hook, line, and sinker.
For a while, yeah. They were seen as this innovative, high-flying company, but it was all smoke and mirrors.
And when the truth came out, it all came crashing down.
It did. The company went bankrupt, Thousands of employees lost their jobs and their retirement savings, and investors lost billions of dollars.
And the National University article says that the total losses from the Enron scandal were around $74 billion.
Yeah, it was a massive financial hit.
But it wasn't just about the money, right?
Right. There was also a huge loss of trust.
In Enron itself, obviously, but also in the accounting industry and corporate America as a whole.
Absolutely. And that's something that can take years to rebuild.
It's like the whole system gets tainted by these kinds of scandals.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about the definition and the damage, but what about the crimes themselves? What are we actually talking about when we say white-collar crime?
Yeah, what are some of the usual suspects?
Well, we've got embezzlement, for starters, which is basically stealing money that's been entrusted to you.
Okay, so like that controller in Illinois, Rita Crundwell, who stole over $53 million to fund her lavish lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly. She's like the poster child for embezzlement.
And then there are the Ponzi schemes, like Bernie Madoff's infamous $65 billion scam.
Ah, Madoff, the master manipulator. He really took the Ponzi scheme to a whole new level.
It's incredible how he managed to fool so many people for so long.
It's a testament to the power of greed and the allure of easy money.
And the fact that he is able to create this aura of respectability and trustworthiness.
Right. People thought he was this financial genius, but it was all a house of cards.
Okay, so we've got embezzlement, Ponzi schemes. What else?
Well, there's securities fraud, which involves manipulating financial data to mislead investors.
Like those big corporate scandals we mentioned earlier. Enron, Tyco, WorldCom.
Exactly. Those cases involve things like cooking the books, inflating revenues, hiding losses, basically anything to make the company look more profitable than it actually was.
And then there's money laundering, which Investopedia describes as making dirty money look clean.
Yeah, it's basically taking the proceeds of criminal activity and moving them through a series of transactions to disguise their origin.
It sounds incredibly complicated.
It can be, but at its core, it's all about creating a false trail to make it seem like the money came from legitimate sources.
And why is that so important for criminals?
Because it allows them to enjoy their ill-gotten gains without raising suspicion.
And to continue their criminal activities without getting caught.
Right. It's a crucial part of many criminal enterprises.
So we've got your classic white-collar crimes, embezzlement, Ponzi schemes, securities fraud, money laundering.
Right. But then, looking at this Pakistani legal website, they list cellular phone fraud and weights and measures offenses as well.
Huh. That's interesting. I don't think those would typically be considered white-collar crimes here in the U.S.
It's a reminder that these categories can be fluid and context-dependent.
Yeah, what's considered white-collar crime in one country might not be in another.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how those offenses are defined and prosecuted in Pakistan.
And what the cultural and societal factors are that might have led to their inclusion under this umbrella of white-collar crime.
That's a really good question. I'd love to learn more about that.
Me too. But I think that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, we're already running long for this segment.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the Pakistani legal system and how they approach this whole issue of white-collar crime. Because this is where I think things start to get really fascinating.
Okay, I'm all ears. What have you found?
Well, this law firm's website mentions that Pakistan has this National Accountability Ordinance of 1999, which seems like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is. It essentially gives them sweeping powers to investigate and prosecute corruption.
Like what kind of powers?
Well, they can freeze assets, conduct raids, make arrests, and even extradite suspects from other countries.
Wow, that's a lot of power.
It is. And it shows how seriously they're taking this issue of white-collar crime.
So they're not messing around.
Nope. And in addition to this ordinance, they also have specific sections in the Pakistan Penal Code that target bribery and the misuse of authority.
So they're really taking a multi-pronged approach.
Absolutely. They're going after the individuals involved in these crimes, but they're also trying to address the systemic issues that allow corruption to flourish.
It's interesting to see how their approach differs from other countries.
Yeah, each country has its own unique legal framework and cultural context.
But here's something I found really interesting. The website also mentions that the courts can be lenient if the accused agrees to return the money they stole.
That's an interesting wrinkle. I haven't heard of that before.
Me neither. It seems like they're prioritizing the recovery of stolen assets over punishment in some cases.
Maybe it's a way to incentivize cooperation and make it easier to get the money back.
Yeah, because if you know you're going to face a harsh sentence regardless, why would you bother cooperating?
Right. It's like a plea bargain, but instead of a reduced sentence, you're getting a chance to avoid punishment altogether.
As long as you give back the money, of course.
Exactly. It's definitely a different approach than we typically see in other countries.
But it makes you wonder how effective it is.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see some data on how often this provision is used and whether it actually leads to higher rates of asset recovery.
Me too. But I think that's a question for another day.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have. We've talked about how white-collar crime is defined, the impact it has, and even delved into the Pakistani legal system and how they approach these crimes.
But we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. There's still so much more to explore.
Like, who are these people committing these crimes? What are your motivations?
And what are the legal tools and strategies used to combat them?
Those are all great questions, and we'll be tackling them in the next part of our deep dive.
So stay tuned.
We'll be right back. So, welcome back to our deep dive into white-collar crime.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure out what makes someone commit these crimes.
Especially when they seem like, well, normal people, right?
Exactly. We were just talking about that Wikipedia article that says most white-collar criminals are middle-aged, employed, educated, not exactly your stereotypical criminal.
Right, right. It's not like the movies.
So what drives these people? What makes them risk it all?
Well, the Forbes article we got had some thoughts on that.
Okay, lay it on me. What did Forbes say?
Well, one thing they pointed out is that some companies, maybe without even realizing it, create this culture where financial goals are everything.
Like more important than ethics even.
Yeah, kind of. Like, it's all about hitting those numbers no matter what.
So it's almost like the company itself is pushing people towards unethical behavior.
Yeah, in a way. And especially if hitting those targets means big bonuses or promotions, well,
Yeah, I can see how that would be tempting.
right. The pressure can be intense.
And I guess when you're in that kind of environment, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture.
Totally. You're so focused on the bottom line that you don't stop to think about the consequences.
And Forbes also talked about how weak enforcement of ethics rules can make things worse.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If a company doesn't take ethics seriously, if they let small things slide.
Then it sends a message that those rules don't really matter.
Exactly. It becomes a slippery slope,
You start by bending the rules a little and then,
And then before you know it, you're crossing the line.
yikes. And then Forbes also mentioned that some of these white-collar criminals, they might actually believe they're not hurting anyone
Yeah, like it's a victimless crime.
because they're not, physically harming anyone.
Right. And they might think that the financial losses are spread out among so many people that it doesn't really matter.
But as we've seen, that's definitely not true.
Nope. The ripple effects of these crimes can be huge.
Absolutely. So we got a better handle on the why, but what about the how? How do these criminals get caught?
Well, that's where agencies like the FBI and the SEC come in.
Ah, the feds?
Yep. They've got whole teams dedicated to investigating this stuff.
And those investigations must be super complicated, right?
Oh, yeah, incredibly. You're talking about tracing money through all sorts of shell companies and offshore accounts.
Sounds like a real headache.
It is, for sure. It's like piecing together a giant puzzle.
In the Wex Encyclopedia entry, we also talked about the importance of whistleblowers.
Whistleblowers, yeah.
Yeah.
They're the ones who come forward and expose the wrongdoing.
Right. Often at great personal risk.
Exactly. And their information can be crucial to these investigations.
Because they have that inside knowledge, right?
Exactly. They can point investigators in the right direction, tell them what to look for.
And Wex mentioned that the SEC even has a program that rewards whistleblowers.
Yeah, they can get a cut of any money that's recovered as a result of their information.
Wow, so they're not just doing the right thing, they can actually get paid for it.
Right. It's a way to incentivize people to come forward and report these crimes.
Because let's face it takes a lot of courage to blow the whistle on your employer or colleagues.
It does. You're risking your career, your reputation, maybe even your safety.
So those protections are really important.
Absolutely. Okay, so what happens to these white-collar criminals once they're caught?
Yeah, what are the consequences?
Well, it depends on the crime, but we're talking about fines, prison time, even asset forfeiture.
Wex said the federal sentencing guidelines usually recommend longer sentences if there's been substantial financial harm.
Right. The punishment should fit the crime.
But they also said that sentences can be reduced if the defendant cooperates.
Yeah, if they take responsibility for their actions, help investigators, stuff like that.
So there's some wiggle room there.
A little bit. It's a recognition that rehabilitation is also a goal of the justice system.
Not just punishment.
Right. Okay, before we move on, I wanted to circle back to that responsible corporate officer doctrine we talked about earlier.
Yeah, that one sounded pretty intense.
It is It basically says that high-ranking executives can be held responsible for their company's crimes.
Even if they weren't directly involved.
Exactly. It's based on the idea that they have a duty to oversee their company's operations and make sure they're complying with the law.
So ignorance is not a defense.
Not if you're the one in charge.
And Wex cited those 2 Supreme Court cases that established this doctrine.
Oh yeah, United States v. Dotterweich and United States v. Park.
What were those about again?
Well, Dotterweich involved the president of a drug company that was shipping out adulterated drugs.
Okay.
And even though there was no evidence he knew about the violations, he was still convicted.
Wow, so just because he was the president, he was held responsible.
Yeah, the court said he had a responsibility to oversee his company's operations.
And what about United States v. Park?
That one was about the president of a supermarket chain who was convicted because of a rodent infestation in one of his warehouses. Yeah, he said he delegated that responsibility to someone else, but the court said he was still ultimately responsible.
Wow, so it's like they're saying, if you're the boss, you better make sure your company's following the rules.
Exactly. Or you could end up facing criminal charges yourself.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the motivations behind these crimes, the complexities of investigating them, the importance of whistleblowers, and the consequences for those who are caught.
And we've even touched on some legal precedents that emphasize corporate accountability.
Yeah, it's been a really eye-opening conversation.
It has. But we're not done yet. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to look at some real-world examples of these crimes and how they impact victims and society as a whole.
I'm ready for it. Bring on the real-life stories.
Mm.
Okay, so we're back and ready for part 3.
Yeah, time to dive into some real-life examples.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty. See how this stuff actually plays out.
Exactly, because it's one thing to talk about theories and concepts, but it's another to see how these crimes impact real people.
Right, it's like, okay, we've got the definition, the motivations, the laws, but what about the actual stories?
Yeah, the human cost of white-collar crime.
So let's start with embezzlement. Remember that Rita Crundwell case from the National University article?
Oh yeah, the comptroller in Illinois who stole, like, what was it, $53 million?
That's the one.
Unbelievable.
And she did it over 2 decades.
2 decades? How do you even pull that off?
I know, right? Apparently, she was really good at covering her tracks, funneling money into fake accounts, forging documents, all sorts of stuff.
And she used the money for, like, a horse ranch and designer belt buckles?
Yeah, among other things, she was living the high life.
Crazy. And the worst part is she was stealing from her own community.
Exactly. The people she was supposed to be serving.
So not only did it hurt the city financially, but it also totally eroded trust in the local government.
Right. Like, who can you trust if you can't even trust the people who are managing your tax dollars?
Okay, so that's embezzlement on a local level. But then you've got these huge Ponzi schemes, like the Madoff case. Ah, yeah, Bernie Madoff, the king of the Ponzi scheme.
$65 billion. Can you even imagine?
It's mind-blowing how one person could deceive so many people for so long.
And his victims were everyone from individual investors to huge charities to even, like, pension funds.
Yeah, it was a massive web of deceit.
And it left so many people financially ruined.
It really did. It was a devastating blow to the financial system and to people's faith in investing.
Okay, so we've got embezzlement, Ponzi schemes. What about securities fraud?
Well, that brings us back to Enron.
Ah, yes, the poster child for corporate greed.
Remember those accounting shenanigans they were pulling?
Hiding debt, inflating their stock price, basically cooking the books.
Yeah, and they were getting away with it for years. They were hailed as this innovative company, Wall Street darlings.
But it was all a lie.
And when the truth finally came out, it was like a bomb went off.
The company went bankrupt. Investors lost billions. Employees lost their jobs and their retirement savings.
It was a complete disaster, and it led to all sorts of reforms in corporate governance and accounting practices.
Like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
Yeah, that was a big one. It was designed to prevent another Enron from happening.
So some good did come out of it, I guess.
You could say that it definitely brought more attention to the issue of corporate fraud and the need for greater transparency and accountability.
Okay, let's talk about money laundering, because I feel like that one can be a little harder to grasp.
Yeah, it's definitely more complex than, say, someone just stealing money from a cash register.
Like, how exactly do you make dirty money look clean?
Well, it involves moving the money through a series of transactions, often using shell companies, offshore accounts, all sorts of shady stuff.
So you're basically creating this complicated paper trail to disguise the origin of the money.
Exactly, and make it look like it came from legitimate sources.
And why is that so important for criminals?
Well, for one thing, it allows them to spend their ill-gotten gains without raising suspicion.
Right, because if you suddenly show up with a bunch of cash and no explanation, people are going to start asking questions.
Exactly. And for another thing, it allows them to continue their criminal activities.
Because if they can't launder the money, they can't really profit from their crimes, right?
Right. It's a crucial part of many criminal enterprises.
So money laundering, even though it might seem less tangible than something like embezzlement or fraud, it's still a huge problem.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It fuels all sorts of criminal activities, from drug trafficking to terrorism to human trafficking.
It's like the lifeblood of the criminal underworld.
You could say that. And it's a global problem.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into white-collar crime.
We have. We've gone from the basics to the complexities.
From the definitions to the motivations to the laws to the real-world examples.
And I think we've all learned a lot along the way.
I know I have. It's been really eye-opening.
It's made me realize just how pervasive white-collar crime is.
Yeah, it's not just something that happens in big corporations or on Wall Street.
It can happen anywhere, in any industry, in any community.
And it can have devastating consequences for individuals, families, businesses, even the entire economy.
So it's something we all need to be aware of.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about these crimes, the better equipped we'll be to prevent them and protect ourselves.
Right. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, but this is really just the beginning of the conversation.
Exactly. There's so much more to learn and explore.
So if you're interested in learning more about white-collar crime, there are tons of resources out there.
Yeah, books, articles, documentaries, even other podcasts.
Just do your research and stay informed.
Because as we've seen today, this is an issue that affects us all.
All right, that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.